My name is Maria Barnes, and I am the chapter president of the Access User Group Lunchtime group. I also, in my rest of my life, run a small custom software company called Barnes Business Solutions. I have been a Microsoft Office Apps and Services MVP, concentrating in Microsoft Access for about almost 4 years now. Logistically, if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to type in the chat window. Also, you could unmute yourself to ask questions during the meeting. If you are not muted right now, if you would go ahead and mute yourself just so I don't get background noise in the recording, that would be wonderful. All right, today's topic is Access versus PowerApps. There we go. You might ask why I chose this topic for today. And the answer is that in the last month's webinar, we do this once a month for Access Lunchtime, I took a little survey, and there was maybe 10 people that responded to that. The survey asked about whether or not you would be interested in still holding a webinar this week because it's a holiday week. I didn't know who would be around and who wouldn't, but probably most of us are all still home instead of traveling. So we decided to go ahead and have it. And then of the responses of what you would want to see in a future webinar, I had these three: comparing Access to PowerApps, the Power Platform and integration with it, and how to deal with web forms. I thought all three of those were closely enough related to PowerApps that was a high call for this topic. Just of other interest, a couple other items that were on the list of future desired topics. One was reports using the Crosstab query. And this is a link here to a video on our YouTube done by the Eastern Time chapter very recently, and it's already, the video is already available. So they just cover this topic. So if you are interested in that, see that video to view that. And then also SQL Security was an ask, and that was actually just done I think late last week, again by the Eastern Time group, Access User Group. And so that video should be up soon, but here is a link to the actual event, and so you can see a little bit more about it and know, what the exact topic is and what to watch for. The video should be up very soon. Also, I think pertinent to our discussion today, I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of Microsoft announcements that were made last week that will help with the understanding of the rest of the things we talk about in case you have not heard those announcements. So the first one is Common Data Service, or what we call CDS, is now called Dataverse. That's a rename. It was just announced last week. So you'll start to see that term on the websites, et cetera, et cetera. So CDS equals Dataverse. Dataverse is the new way to talk about it. Also, Microsoft announced the general availability of PowerApps within Teams. And again, here's a link to that announcement. We've been able to do PowerApps. PowerApps has resided outside of Office, kind of in its own application bubble. There's licensing rights, etc., with PowerApps. But now there's going to be a subset of the PowerApps capabilities, including Dataverse, available within Microsoft Teams. So a couple places in the rest of the presentation, I will list out some differences between PowerApps and PowerApps for Teams, or Dataverse and Dataverse for Teams. But in general, there's differences around the cost. The PowerApps for Teams is cheaper or free depending upon connectors, etc. But at least at this point, the service is limited, and it's limited in size, it's limited in types of data fields that are supported, and also some of the functionality that's supported, at least at this point. I think Microsoft's obviously not done with it. It's still something that's new in just generally available last week. So, all right, then without further ado, I'm going to get right into some comparisons. What I've outlined here today to talk about, and this is not designed to be a lecture. This is designed for if you would like to unmute and interrupt and ask more questions, please feel free to do so as we go through each item. If you don't see an item right away, we might cover it later. So if you're just missing a characteristic, you might hold off on asking about that until the end. I'm also going to put a disclaimer on this presentation. While I consider myself to be fairly expert in Microsoft Access, I've been working with it for 20 years, I'm an MVP, I've been running a business, doing a lot of Access. I also do a lot of SQL Server. PowerApps is pretty new, and I am by no means an expert at it, particularly when it comes to the new offering of PowerApps within Teams. That's brand new, just generally available. So I've done very little exploring the very specifics of that. I do have a decent amount of experience with PowerApps, but certainly not going to be able to answer expert level questions on PowerApps. So hopefully this presentation will still provide you information, or at least things to think about to get started finding out more. The first characteristic that I wanted to talk about was application type. So Microsoft Access, the application is from a Windows desktop, unless you're using something like a remote desktop service. For PowerApps, you can still use a desktop. You can also use a mobile device. You can use it on your phone. You can use it on a tablet, something like that. And you cannot do that with Microsoft Access straight as an application. You'd have to go through some kind of remote service if you were wanting to make use of it on a mobile device. So that's a very big difference between the two products. The second is solution type. Access is a file-based solution. You get an ACCDB file or ACCDE file, or if you're working in the older versions, an MDB file, or several variants of both types of those. But it's contained within a physical file. And PowerApps is web-based. So there's no specific file that resides on your computer. It lives in the web at a particular address. Does it require an internet connection? Access? No, at least not out of the box. Of course, if you've got a data source that is in the cloud that you're linking to, then you would need an internet connection to access that. But you could certainly have a local area network or even a single standalone Microsoft Access application and not have internet connection, be able to use it on an airplane, say, where the airplane didn't have Wi-Fi. But PowerApps, it does require an internet connection. So keep that in mind if you're trying to make decisions about a new application, for example, or a modification on an existing application. What types of characteristics do you need, or what is your usage going to be like, and thus what product might fit best? Do you need to have an additional plan purchase? So for Access, no. If you've got Microsoft Office 365, or any version of Microsoft Office that comes with Access, there's nothing additional that you need to purchase. PowerApps, if you are using PowerApps external to Teams, yes, there is a specific PowerApps plan, and actually there's several different versions of it that you need, unless you already have a different type of plan that contains that, like, for instance, the Dynamics plan. PowerApps, rather, is part of that. So, but for the most part, you need an additional purchase unless you are using the new PowerApps for Teams. And in that case, all you need is an Office license that contains Teams. Specifically, is it available with a Microsoft 365 business plan? And I'm not even going to go into the home plans. If you need to know about the home plans, you're just going to have to look it up, because we're going to assume that you're running this for a business. So Microsoft Access is included with all of the Microsoft 365 business plans, except for the Business Basic plan, at least at this point. And I say that at this point, this licensing changes frequently. So if you're listening to this webinar, it's 6 months from now, you might want to double check this information to make sure it's still the same. For PowerApps, if you have a Microsoft 365 business plan, then PowerApps for Teams is included in that. The exception to that is if you have 365 apps version, then you would not have a license for PowerApps for Teams with that. Can simple applications be created by a non-IT user? And that might be very important for your particular usage. If you're a small business and you're wanting your users to be able to set up their own simple applications, can they do it? And the answer is, in both situations, yes. So now, more complicated ones, probably for both, you need someone with a little bit more skill level to do something more complicated. But they're both designed to be fairly easy to use, to be able to write basic low or no code solutions in the application by a non-IT or by someone with less skills than a developer.
Maria?
Yes.
Back to the going to up about whether it's available, and you say it's available for Teams except for apps versions.
Does that
mean mobile?
So no. What I mean by that is there are various types of Microsoft 365 business plans that you can purchase. One of those is called an apps version. So it has the online stuff like Excel and Outlook and some of those online applications as part of that version, but it doesn't include Teams with that license.
Okay, I understand now.
I hope that makes sense. So if you have Teams, you should have the availability to have PowerApps for Teams. It's just whether or not you would have Teams with that license or not. Hopefully that clarifies that. We got a comment up here. If you have Business Basic, you can create PowerApps that connect to OneDrive, Excel, SharePoint. If you want to use CDS and other connectors, it costs more. Yeah, again, I'm certainly no expert on all the licensing, but hopefully some of this information will get you at least started looking in the right spot for what you need to know about that. And does PowerApps work in the free version of Teams? So I'll be honest, I don't know the answer to that. I would doubt it, because you're going to have a workspace, a Teams workspace, in order to create those applications in, so that they can store the Dataverse data and that kind of thing in it. And that just doesn't come with the free version. The free version is more designed for you to be a guest client on someone else's client. So you actually need the Teams data portion of the client, if that makes sense. So the last option here, does it require a software installation for each use location? And for Microsoft Access, yes, it does. So if someone is going to run your Access application, they need some type of software in order to run that, meaning some version of Microsoft Access to run the application itself. You can't open an ACCDB file, for example, with some other software. It has to be with a Microsoft Access product. You can use Runtime, which is a free option, but you do need to worry about, actually installing the software on the computers or locations that you're going to use it from. PowerApps, maybe. It depends upon what type you're using. If you are doing strictly the web-based versions that reside within a browser, probably not. But on at least some of the ways to do it for mobile devices, you have to do like a client install. You might have to for that, but probably less so than for Microsoft Access. Can the application display data? You may think that's a simple characteristic, but I wanted to get some of these simple things out there because, you just don't want to assume. But yes, they both can display data. Can you add or modify data? Yes. So basic CRUD, create, read, update, delete, those characteristics or those capabilities in that case are freely available with both. Can you make this a multi-user application? And the answer to both of those is yes. There is a correct way to do that in Microsoft Access, and so I mentioned this for completeness here. It's highly suggested that you separate out the data portion of Microsoft Access application into a back end and then a separate front end, and that each user open their own copy of the front end. And that's mostly for avoidance of corruption purposes. Can the application store its own data? And with Microsoft Access, the answer is yes. If you think about Microsoft Access, the application portion of it are the forms, the queries, the reports that you create, and then the data is the tables portion. You can have it all in one file if you want, especially if you're only using it for one person. But, see the note about, separating it out. But if you separate it out, they are both still Access files. It's just that one contains the data and the other contains the application. For PowerApps, no. PowerApps itself does not have data. Its default data source is Microsoft Dataverse. And notice I mentioned CDS or Common Data Service here just for completeness. The actual data is in Microsoft Dataverse, not in the Power App itself. And both Access and Power Apps can connect to other types of data as well. I think that's further down the list here. But is the data relational? And the answer in both cases is yes. So, you can draw relationships between tables using keys and that kind of thing. In my opinion, Microsoft Access is a little bit more user-friendly in that way. You have a tool to, use drag and drop relationships within it and enforce referential integrity and that kind of thing. So in my opinion, Microsoft Access is a little more complete. You can use both as relational data sources. And again, when we say Power Apps here, I'm talking about the Dataverse portion, not Power Apps itself. Size limit. Access has 2 gigabytes per database. So of course you could get around that. You could have one front end that connected to 2 or more backends so that, each of those backends had a 2 gigabyte limit. And I'll be honest, most business applications I see are more like 500 megabytes, not 2 gigabytes anyway, but it's there. It is a limit for some that, some people need to go higher than that, I have one client that makes use of medical data. There's like 5 million rows in one table. So obviously that's not going to fit in a 2 gigabyte file. That's in SQL Server. PowerApps for Teams, it also has a 2 gigabyte limit. So same limit if you're in PowerApps for Teams or your Dataverse for Teams. The regular PowerApps outside of Teams it varies. From what I could find on it, looking up different resources, and again, this could change 6 months from now. It depends upon your plan type. Let me see if I can recall. Some plans are app-based plans, like how many apps you have or can have. Some plans are user-based, like how many users you can have. So dependent upon the type of plan you have for PowerApps, you might have anywhere from 1 to 10 gigabytes as a limit on your size. So again, it varies a little bit. We have a question whether Access can connect to the same data in the Microsoft Dataverse. George, are you asking whether Access can connect to Dataverse? Let's talk about that here in just a second while we talk a little bit about, because Access can connect to a lot of different types of data, and so can PowerApps. The types of data and the ways that they connect are a bit different, but they can both connect. So here it is, wide variety of data types. So at the moment, Dataverse for Teams has more limitations on it than Dataverse outside of Teams as far as the types of connectors that you can have. But you're probably familiar with, and let me see if I can pull over the Northwind database here to view. You're probably familiar with the external data tab and the new data sources. There's lots of different types, you can do. There's several different file types. There's several different database types, including like SQL Server and Azure. There's online services like SharePoint lists, Dynamics 365. So Dynamics 365 is stored, that data is Dataverse. It's not the same as if you make a Dataverse in Teams client. You can't right now directly connect to that through Microsoft Access as far as I'm aware. I can see that coming in the future. I know that there's been, I think I have a link to that at the end on the user voice. People have requested that, and being able to link to PowerApp data, which is Dataverse now, and it looks like that is in the plan. So ODBC connections, and you can make ODBC connections to a lot of different sources. So that's from Microsoft Access, the type of connectors. For PowerApps, there are tons of them. And yes, in my mind right now, kind of the most central, if you, for example, wanted to have a Microsoft Access application, it runs in your business, it does maybe 90% of the things that you need to do in-house on a local area network, but you have some things that you need to do from a mobile application. Maybe you've got inventory you need to take, or you have a sales person that's, going out and visiting client sites, and you need to have a web part to it. Prior to PowerApps, what you would probably do is put at least some of the data into SQL, whether it's on-premise, whether it's SQL Azure, whatever. And then you used to write a web app to, a .NET web app or whatever kind to connect to that same data or part of that same data. PowerApps can do that. It can connect to SQL It can connect to lots of different types. It can connect directly to an Excel spreadsheet or a SharePoint list. Access can do those things as well. Let's see, I'm going back to the chat here to see if I can answer some questions. So I think, George, at least at the moment, the question is, the point he's after is whether adopting PowerApps for a mobile experience means giving up an access front end to the data if the data is in this Dataverse. I think the answer right now is yes, but you could put the data for both things in SQL. Now, I would say that I believe the SQL connector for PowerApps is currently a cost from PowerApps, so that might add some costs onto it for that. Karl mentions that Dataverse as a connector and Access has been announced for Access by the Access team for next year. Okay, I didn't know that Power was officially announced, Karl, but thank you for clarifying that. So at some point next year, we will have the capability to do what George is wanting to do, which is to directly connect from Access to your Dataverse database. So at that point, it will be simpler for you to have a hybrid type application where you made use of the same data from two spots, perhaps a desktop application in Access and a mobile application with PowerApps. What else we got here? Yes, you could connect Access front end to Azure and a Power App to that same Azure database. Yes, that is possible. Okay, so let's just be clear. Dataverse is, and it is confusing. No apologies are needed at all for going back and forth on this. Dataverse is a data space, like SQL Azure, like Microsoft Access can be. It is the default data source for Power Apps. You can have a Power App that's connected to something besides Dataverse, or it can connect to multiple things. You can have some tables in Dataverse and some in SQL Azure, for example. So hopefully that's good. Yeah, Karl, Power Apps for Teams is included, just for clarity. You say Power Apps is included in most M365 plans. That's Power Apps for Teams. But if you're using Power Apps outside of Teams, I don't believe that is entirely true, that it's included, the Power Apps portion of it. I could be wrong, though. All right, well, that'd be great, Karl, if that's true. If you could find that reference, I'd be happy to see that, or maybe we can share that just to clarify, because that was not my understanding. But if it is, good. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Maria Barnes. I wanted to take a quick break from the recorded video to provide a clarification regarding the licensing for Power Apps. Some of the items that I mentioned regarding the licensing were not true or as clear as they could be. So for clarity and correction, the standard connectors available with Power Apps are covered at no cost or no extra cost, I should say, by most Microsoft 365 and Office 365 licenses. With those, you can use Power Apps for no extra charge and connect to standard connectors like Excel, OneDrive, or SharePoint lists. It is only when you go to the premium connectors like SQL or what used to be called CDS and is now called Dataverse that you need the per app or per user Power App licenses. So please keep that in mind. PowerApps, also PowerApps inside Teams has access to a specific form of Dataverse and standard connectors. If you want to access SQL, for example, which is a premium connector, or the full version of Dataverse, that's still a premium connector. So you still have to have some type of a license to do that. So the thing that PowerApps inside Teams gives you is Dataverse inside Teams with that 2 GB limit, different than the standard PowerApps. I hope that provides clarification on this subject for you. And now we will resume the rest of the recorded webinar. Thank you. All right, where are we here? Can we connect to outside data? Yes, Microsoft Access can. PowerApps, yes, it can. Although, just a word of warning, some of the connectors are at an additional cost. And I believe the SQL connector is one of those. So the simpler you stay, the cheaper it is, obviously. Can you leverage external process automation? That's a hard question to ask because I'm sure there are ways to do that within Microsoft Access. You'd have to get pretty creative, but PowerApps, you can definitely make use of products like Microsoft Flow to do process automation from and integrated with the Power App. Does it have built-in security? Microsoft Access, the answer is no, at least not for the ACCDB format. If you recall, the MDB format has some workgroup security that you could set up for it. But for Access, there's no built-in security. PowerApps does have that. So if that's something that's important to your application or your organization, that might be something you might want to check out. It is based on Office 365 user security and the policy configuration. So there is some setup there in order to get it to work like you would like. You know, you can do some things with Microsoft Access, for example, the fact that it is a file. In order to use an application, you have to have read and write access to the actual file application that is in a specific directory someplace. So your users need read and write access to it. But you could, for example, use just Windows folder security to prevent certain users from even getting to that folder. So you could use Windows security to apply some security to Access, but that security is not really within Access itself. Does it have a report designer? And for Microsoft Access, the answer is yes. It's got a built-in report designer. For PowerApps, no. The controls in PowerApps are form or display based. There's not reporting capabilities within it. Typically, people use Power BI to do reporting from PowerApps. Although a lot of us use Microsoft Excel to report from Access as well. So the Microsoft Access reports are pretty powerful. Okay, so responsive. And by responsive, I mean, does the form realign, the controls on the form realign according to whether you have a phone that's 2 or 3 inches by 5 inches, or a tablet that's, 8 by 10 or 8 by 11 or something like that, or you've got a Windows desktop that has, a much larger screen. And the answer, at least right now, for Access is no. There is a user voice request to add responsiveness to Access that Microsoft has said that they're planning on doing this for forms. I don't know how far out that might be, but PowerApps, yes, it is responsive, at least for the non-Teams version. At this point, it's not responsive for PowerApps from Teams, but I do believe that that's in their plan. They just wanted to get out the most critical features or characteristics on this first pass and make it generally available to everybody. And I expect that in the next year or two, you'll see more and more features added to the PowerApps for Teams version. Can you do backups? Yes, for Microsoft Access, and yes, for PowerApps. Since Access is file-based, it's as simple as copying the file. PowerApps, it's a little bit more complicated than that to do a manual backup, but for Dataverse itself, there's automated backups that are being done for you, and you don't have to physically do anything. So actually, I think that's next step. Automated backups. Yes, PowerApps has them built in. Access does not have them built in. It is easy to implement them. You know, if you're running the back or have the back end on a local server or something like that, chances are you have some kind of backup for your server already in place. But you know, just a word of warning that I do get at least one call a year. My data is all corrupt. How long ago was your most recent backup, I ask. Backup? So you do need to make sure you back up your data in Microsoft Access. It's not automated all by itself from the application. Catch up to my chats here. I get a yay for responsive forms and in Access, and Jim comments that there are some limited type capabilities, responsive type capabilities in Microsoft Access right now, like anchoring. Agreed, Jim, that it is, if you design it correctly and need it to be responsive, you can get it to be a little bit responsive, but it's not really inherently built in to do it on its own without you taking some extra steps. And even once you do, it's not totally responsive like you would want it to be at this point. How about restore? Yes, for Access, just use copy. PowerApps, yes, you can use restore. You know, it's not automated, obviously. You have to go in and manually restore, but you can do so. Business logic. The answer is yes, you can do it through both. For Microsoft Access, typically you do it through VBA. Some people use macros and that kind of thing as well, but the most typical way to implement business logic is through VBA. PowerApps, the typical approach is through something called formulas. You might have business logic, for example, that said, you know, show this field on this form if certain conditions are met, or, you know, don't allow this to be saved unless certain conditions are met. Certain fields are filled out, or, you know, whatever. Those type of things are what we're talking about by business logic. Can you import data? Yes, for Microsoft Access. PowerApps, I don't believe you can do so directly in PowerApps itself, but you can do so through connectors. Can you import the application to a new environment? Yes, for Access, it's pretty easy. It's file-based, so you know, you'd copy it and move it to another file or to a different environment, that same file. And of course, you have to have an application to run it, etc., Microsoft Access to run it. PowerApps, you can, for regular PowerApps right now, import an application into a different environment, but you can't do it through PowerApps or Teams yet. So if you have two different teams and you want to use the same application in both teams, you can't really save the application and then import it into the other Power App. Let's see, Karen, you asked, what about more complicated business logic? Take a field from this screen, look up related data in a table, enter records in another table. For something that is, like you say, more complicated, that's reasonably easy to do in VBA. For Power Apps, if you wanted to do something like that, you would probably need to make use of something like Flow and then do that portion through a Flow piece, because you can't really do complicated logic. The logic's within the Power Apps itself on the forms is more restricted. You can't do a whole huge series of things. That's when you would source that out to Flow. Can you export data? Again, the answer is yes. And for Power Apps, the comment, you can from Dataverse, but only if you're using Dataverse for Teams at the moment, you can only do that through connectors. You can't do it straight from Dataverse for Teams yet. I think that's coming soon. So what's our conclusion? And we can, open it up to other questions and stuff as well. But I didn't want to write a conclusion on here. I just wanted to talk about it because, in my opinion, there's a lot of characteristics. Each application has its own needs. Each business has different characteristics and has its own needs and circumstances. So I think it just depends. It depends upon your scenario. I am much more familiar with Microsoft Access. I think it's easy to use. It's by responsive this time, I mean quickness of when I do something and when something responds in the user interface. But as far as developing, setting up forms, etc., I find doing so in Microsoft Access to be a faster experience. Because Power Apps is web-based, you get that lag, between when you do something and when it responds. And I suppose that totally depends upon your internet connection and that kind of stuff as well. If you're on a real speedy internet connection, you might not see the lag that I see when I'm designing Power Apps. But my preference at this point, at least, and if you ask me 5 years from now, I may feel differently, but if it's simple, if it needs to be on the web, or if a part of it needs to be in the web, I think Power Apps is a wonderful way to go. If it's more complicated, if a desktop is a viable solution for you, I'd prefer to do my application in Access. But that's kind of my personal preference. You're going to have your own. And again, certainly in some pieces of applications would be a better choice to use a Power App. All right, comments on that. Karl mentions rich client in Access, a light client in Power Apps. I'm not really following your comment, Karl. Do you want to unmute and explain a little bit more what you were talking about there?
Yes, I think they are complementing each other. Like every web or mobile tool, Power Apps can complement Access with its web and mobile capabilities. So what I do is I have a rich client with SharePoint as backend in Access, and I connect a light Power App client with the SharePoint data to have a mobile client. That's where I see the parts, the positions of Access and Power Apps.
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, totally. It doesn't have to be one or the other. That's not what this is about. This is about where is the strengths in one and where are the strengths in the other. And I think that what you're talking about complementing each other, we might also call hybrid, where you are sharing the same data and you're using two different applications depending upon what you're doing. Maybe your office staff uses the rich Access client because they're in front of their computer and they're sitting at a desk and they get a better application user interface with that Access application. But your mobile users can't get that or can't get it very nicely. And so for them, the PowerApps is a great tool for them.
You can have a lot of these comparisons nowadays. Videos like PowerApps would be the new Access, and I don't see it like that because you can do so much more with Access. As I said, rich clients, and you can't, at least at this point, do it with PowerApps, but people don't get it. They want to sell their PowerApps solution, so they say it's the new Access. That's what I see at LinkedIn and everywhere.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I mean, at least from my experience so far, using them and setting them up, I find PowerApps to be more appropriate if the application's fairly simple. And if it's got to be too complicated, I just feel like it kind of gets lost. You can only display one form at a time and it's back and forth. And, again, that may just be my bias, but I don't think Access is going away at this point. I don't think PowerApps is a replacement, but I think it's a great complement to it. There's a couple of resources here, and I will have this slide deck available. I'll publish it to PDF. If you follow this our Access Lunchtime user group web link, there's a blog post area on there, and that's where I'll post the PDF for this, and I'll do that later this afternoon. This is the link to the Microsoft's considering how to better integrate with PowerApps. I hadn't realized that they made the announcement public yet about sometime next year. And if you want an informative newsletter, and also our group, if you want to get the emails each month, there's a link to join on the group, and what that will do is put you on the mailing list, so you'll get each month's invitations via email instead of, I don't know where everyone heard it. We have a great group today. Obviously, it's an interesting topic. 28 participants today. That must be an all-new record. Thank you for those who helped spread the word on this today and get the word out. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up. Somebody requested that I put my video on. I'm just going to be totally honest with you. Since COVID, I stopped putting makeup on because every time I wear a mask, can you see? Can you see me? Oh, no. Oh, there we go. Can you see me now?
Yes, we can see you, Maria.
Yes. I stopped wearing makeup too.
You did? Well, when you put a mask on, it gets all over the mask. So I'm just like, okay. All right. Anyone else have any questions, comments, thoughts about PowerApps that you want to add? Experience? Have you been using them? What has your experience been? Ben?
So how well can PowerApps connect to an on-prem data source?
As long as you have a connection that's exposed to the outside, if you allow that, if you could use a web app and connect to it, you can connect to it from PowerApps. It's, there's a SQL data connector, and you can set up the website and everything, or the connection string and everything as part of adding the connector.
Usually corporations don't want to expose their SQL Server database to the internet.
That
right?
is often the case. So yes, you are essentially exposing it over that.
Okay.
So
I
that
thought
might
maybe
be
if
a
Teams is running
consideration as
locally,
well.
then it would have access to local data.
Yeah.
Just to answer Ben's question, you can have a data connector, a local one, an interface. It exists. You can connect almost everything to PowerApps, also local data.
So you could use like a local ODBC connection that you set up?
No, how is it called? There's a tool available from Microsoft. It's what's it called? It's let me have a look. But you can connect local data to PowerApps. No problem.
Okay. I know you can connect like, an Excel spreadsheet and that kind of thing, but for the most part, you have to remember that it's a web-based app. If you're sharing it with other people,
it's called data gateway. If you have such a local data gateway, you can connect everything. Also local data.
Data gateway.
I'm Googling that now.
We did show it several times at my conferences, so it's possible. But you have to open up some ports, of course.
Right,
So
and that means talking to IT, which pretty much means no.
Yes. You have to talk to IT and secure the connection, but it's possible technically.
Have to make amends with IT.
It's hard to drop off donuts now virtually.
True.
All right, so we do have a couple other questions, comments in here. Someone's asking about the next meeting. The lunchtime group meetings are the last Tuesday of every month. I think that I'm still going to do a December meeting. It's after Christmas. It's like the 29th or something like that. In general, they're the last Tuesday every month. And then the Access User Group, let me put this over here. If you go to their main site, on the main web page, you can actually see all the upcoming events all on the main page. There's several different groups. There's a SQL Server with Access group. There's a Latino group and an Española group. I hope I pronounced that right. ET stands for Eastern Time. That's kind of a breakfast club. It's, I think, held on Fridays around 8 or 9 in the morning. Yeah. So depending upon where you're at and how that maps with your schedule, yeah, December 29th is the next schedule Access Lunchtime.
Hey, I want to say a little plug for the SQL Server with Access group. Next month, hopefully we're going to be revealing a new tool that Juan has developed to help you work with SQL Server and Access. So
sounds great.
I want to come see it.
So that's December 8th. That's coming up here in a little over a week. One other comment here I saw, access time to develop forms and data checking. Diane, do you want to pop up and ask what you were talking about there? I think what you're saying is it's easier to do that or quicker to do that in Microsoft Access right now. Is that what you were trying to get at? Chat 140. I mean 1240? Oh, it's probably 140 for you. All right, let me look. Oops. More complicated business logic. Yes, yeah. For that kind of business logic as well, if you're trying to do more things with your form, you can do quite a bit with PowerApps once you get the hang of doing the expressions in there. But at the end, maybe depending upon how complicated it is as far as like data validation and that kind of stuff, maybe that might be easier to do in Access. I expect the more and more that you use PowerApps, the more you'll find different tricks and stuff. I know I've already learned some things like to make it quicker to respond on the UI and stuff, you can set up some local variables, filling data sources. If you're going to hit on a data source, like on every page, then you're continually bumping against the data, and you can put that into memory, and it speeds up things and stuff like that. So there's lots of tricks to learn. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you have, if you're US based, I hope you have a great Thanksgiving holiday. And I really appreciate everyone joining us here today. Hope you learned at least one or two things from the presentation, and or this gave you some food for thought. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent presentation. Thank you, Maria.